The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. On a certain Sabbath, Jesus went into the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely to see if he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might discover a reason to accuse him. But he realized their intentions and said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up and stand before us." And he rose and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil, to save life rather than to destroy it?" Looking around at all of them, he then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. They became enraged and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord. In 1610, a young Jesuit seminarian came to the Americas, to Cartagena, which was then called New Spain, now part of Colombia. He was not yet ordained a priest. That was to happen a few years later. He never returned to Spain. His name was Pedro Claver, or Peter Claver as we know him. He was motivated by a passion to serve the poorest and the most oppressed of God's people, the ones most neglected. About 50 to 75 years earlier, the Portuguese had brought the first boatload of kidnapped Africans to the New World. That's in the first part of the 1500s, within 50 years after Columbus had so-called discovered America. And of course, those immediately after him discovered the riches that were theirs for the plundering in the Americas. What the Portuguese and the Spanish discovered was that the natives in America were too independent to be useful as slaves working in the gold and silver mines, as well as on the plantations with which the Spaniards and the Portuguese plundered, exploited this new world. Very early after the slave trade began, the Pope, in no uncertain terms, condemned it. But of course, as also often happens, pious Catholics put the things of this world above the teachings of the Church. They adhere to the Church kind of when it's convenient and when it supports them. Some theologians said, well, these native peoples, whether they are of the Americas or whether they are African, they're not as fully human as we Europeans are. And particularly if they're not Christian, well, then it's okay to exploit them for slave labor. The church, of course, never taught that, and the church condemned repeatedly the slave trade. But sadly, that did not stop Christians who maintained a veneer of their piety, but really were greedy and lustful for money and power, wealth, and expanding their territory. All of this happened, and when St. Peter Claver came to the Americas, the North American slave trade had not yet taken root. That's documented in a wonderful series from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, 1619. That's when the first slave trade ship landed on American soil, North American soil, I should say. Peter Claver knew, as St. Paul knew, that the only way to address slavery was through changing oneself and inviting others to change themselves, to change their own hearts, in order to recognize the human dignity of those who were exploited. And of course, slaves throughout that time, when they were being carted from Africa to the New World, were regarded by shipmasters as mere cargo. And so the minimum was done to try to keep maybe about 2/3 of them alive, so that they could be sold for a profit and be profitable for those settlers in the New World. Now that's talking about the Spanish slave trade, Spanish and Portuguese. Actually, the English were far more cruel and heartless, but that is another issue. Once we got into the English slave trade, conditions were even worse. But St. Peter Claver and a few associates that he was able to gather around him ministered to these people. And he said, we must first feed their mouths before we can feed their souls. So every time a ship came loaded with slave cargo, and about 2/3 the number actually made it onto shore. Many of them at that point were already dying. He brought supplies of medicines, of food, of alcohol and tobacco, which were believed to have medicinal properties for them, and did what he could. They did what they could before they reached the slave market to revive them and to give them hope. After they had reached the slave market, they had no more influence, no more control over them. But those few moments when they were unloaded from the ship, before they were brought into the slave market, they were able to, in some instances, it would seem, work miracles. Maybe not miracles of healing, physical healing, but miracles of the Spirit, giving them a taste of human dignity, giving them a taste that not all white people were cruel, as their shipholders and slave masters would seem to indicate, giving them at least some kind of a glimmer of hope. How much is that example needed today? You know, many Christians put a lot of effort into changing society, and one sometimes wonders how much effort they put into changing hearts. Our own hearts first, and then doing so in a way that is public and communicable. We will change the world by addressing the needs of the Spirit and giving people new hope. In our own day, I think St. Peter Claver is probably a very, very important patron. And maybe we should pray to him that hearts may be changed as his heart was, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, the world be transformed. There's not a lot we can do here, out there. There is a lot we can do here, in here. And when we have nothing left in our own personal lives other than to pray, that prayer, I believe, can become very important. So our house here, Nazareth House, I believe is called to be a powerhouse of prayer. Let us answer that call.